fellows to talk to us today about public speaking, both in terms of presentations and interviews. Before they get started, I just want to take about 30 seconds and explain what the Speaking Fellows are. So Speaking Fellows, as Sonali laughs, are undergraduate peer tutors who can help you with all kinds of public speaking. So if you're preparing for a presentation, if you're practicing for an interview, even if you just want to do some conversation practice, if you're talking, we're listening, and we want to help you. You can find us just down the hallway in the Writing, Speaking, and Argument program space, and we have afternoon and evening hours. You can just go to our website and find that information if you're interested in scheduling an appointment. And our first speaker tonight is going to be Garrett Briggs, who is a junior poli-sci major. And he is going to be talking today about speech structure and memorization. We'll have both talks, and then we'll have time for Q&A and discussion afterwards. Take it away, Garrett.
Hey folks.
Hey Garrett.
Thank you all for coming out today. Like Amy just did a wonderful job talking about, I will be doing my presentation on speech structure and memorization. So without further ado, let's get into it. Now, there's often been a time in your life when you've been posed the problem, I have a speech that's due in an obscenely little amount of time to do it. How do I structure the speech and how do I memorize it? Well folks, that's what I'm here for you to help with you today. Now, when you think of a speech, you might think of something like this. Something that's completely written out, word for word, and that's one way to do a speech. But what I aim to do today is to teach you the basic structure of how to make a speech so that you can take speech writing and make it your own art. To do that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about three things. First, we're going to talk about what generally goes into the structure of a speech. Second, we're going to be talking about how you can fill in that structure. And then finally, we're going to be talking about how you can memorize your speech if you need to do so. So the first thing that I wanted to talk about is a little bit about general speech structure. Now, within all certain types of speeches, there's typically one way, at least in the educational atmosphere, that teachers will teach speeches. I want to emphasize, this is certainly not the only way to give a speech. However, it is the very basic way that is the foundation for a whole bunch of different types of speeches. So there's really three parts to the speech. The first is, you've got the introduction. And the introduction consists of three things, which we'll talk about in detail in just a second. Next, you've got your central points. These points are essentially going to be comprised of the evidence that is going into proving your claim in your speech. And then finally, you're going to have your conclusion, and the conclusion is going to be a reiteration of what you've been talking about the whole speech, and then tying it up with a little bow at the end to tell people why it matters and why they should be paying attention to it. So first, let's go ahead and start on the introduction. The first part to any wonderful speech is to start it off with an attention-to-grabbing device, or what I've called it up here, a hook. It's something that grabs the audience's attention. Something that makes them want to listen to what you have to say. And now there's a few ways to do it, and I've got some of those ways up here if my computer wouldn't black out again. You can see, humor, stuff like that, stories. And it's always good to start off as well with something that ties the reader to the problem, or listener to the problem. Why does it affect the listener to understand and want to learn about your presentation? All of those things are great ways to start a presentation. The second part of your presentation should be explaining what the argument you're about to make is, or why you brought the presentation together in the first place. So I got up here a second ago and told you I was going to tell you a little bit about speech structure and memorization. That's essentially me telling you about the point of this speech and what I want to accomplish today. And then finally, in order to give you a roadmap of what I wanted to do, I told you the 3 points we were going to talk about. A roadmap is important because it puts in the reader's mind what to expect from the speech. They can get a general idea of the evidence you're going to bring to support your argument, or the things that you're going to bring to the table in order to understand your presentation more fully. If you have the reader understanding or the listener understanding where you want to go with it, then it's going to be easier to sell them when you fill in the evidence for those points. Next thing you need to do in a speech is you need to have some main points. Because you can come up here, give a great introduction, say some general claim, and then not support it throughout your speech, and no one is going to be convinced by that. So you need main points throughout your speech. And here's what they're for. They're the evidence for your argument. Another thing that they're for, you might be wondering how many points that you need. Well, it sort of depends on the speech and what you're trying to accomplish. Longer speeches might need more points, or speeches on controversial topics you're trying to convince a whole bunch of people on might need more points, more evidence in order to persuade other people of your opinion. As far as the type of evidence that you can include, we're going to get into that more specifically a little bit later, but outside sources, original arguments of your own that follow logical premises, examples, stuff like that are all great things to include as evidence in the main point section of your speech. And then, as for the why, like I just said, if you don't have any evidence, no one's going to believe you, even if you are their best friend. So, when you're structuring a speech, this is essentially the general outline of what your main points system, or your middle of your speech is going to look like. You're going to have a few central points, and for every central point, you're going to have main evidence to support that central point, as well as supporting evidence as well. So, you might be wondering, there's a lot of different types of evidences in here. What's the difference in all of them? That's what I'm going to explain to you right now. There's main evidence and there's supporting evidence, sort of, when you think about a speech. What the main evidence is doing is it's a broad claim that you're giving about a piece of evidence to prove them of one of your main points in the speech. So for example, if I'm giving a speech and I'm explaining why green is the best color, one of my main points might be, oh, well, everyone loves the color green. But in order to prove that, in order to really prove that, I need something a little bit more. Sure, that might be a general claim that might convince some people, but some other people, some skeptics, some of your friends even, might say, well, how are you going to prove that? The way you prove that is through supporting evidence. So it goes like this. If you've ever had a conversation with your friend, and you've said something and they've disagreed with you, well, likelihood is they said, prove that's the point. When you prove it, what you're doing is you're applying supporting evidence in order to support your general claim that they disagreed with, which was the main evidence. Let's take another example. Let's say I'm having a conversation with one of my friends from Texas, and I'm explaining to this Texan about how brutal the weather is in Rochester, how there's always bad weather in Rochester. Well, they can take that at face value. I don't see why they wouldn't. It's not really a big claim that I'm trying to make here, but they could also not. So if I wanted to back that up, what I could do is I could introduce one main point. I could say, it's really cold in Rochester. But even then, they could say, okay, Garrett, you told me it's really cold, but how are you going to prove that? How really can you prove that to me? And I can tell them, today, it was 64 degrees outside. It is incredibly cold. Last week, it was 40 degrees outside. The week before that, it was negative 20 degrees outside. And then the more and more supporting evidence that I bring, the more convinced they're going to be of my main evidence in that section. In addition, I could add another piece of main evidence. I could say not only is it cold in Rochester, Mr. Texan, it is also dreary. And that could be another main point that I bring to the table. So how can I support that it's dreary? Well, it was raining all last week, it was cloudy all last week, and there was almost never any sun except for the last 2 days. Take that. And once you add more and more main claims and supporting claims, you're going to have a lot of evidence that is really hard to dispute from your friend if they really care about the weather in Rochester. Or more applicably, if they care about what you're saying in your speech. So once you've gone through all of those claims, you've supported it with evidence, next what you do is you're going to close out your presentation strong. And to do that, once again, there's 3 main things that people are going to look for in you closing your presentation. First, they're going to be looking for the argument again. You learn as you do a lot of public speaking or competitions that the more you present to audiences, the less they're going to take away from it. You might have all of this evidence out on the table and the audience, they might not come away with all of it. But by reiterating your main argument in the last section of your speech, at least they can come across away with what you were trying to say. So it is important that when you do your closing argument, your conclusion, anything like that, you actually explain to them in one sentence, two sentences, what it was that you were arguing to them throughout the entirety of the speech. In addition, you should work to summarize your main points. Those main points are just the three things that I listed again at the presentation. I could summarize them. I could say, today we learned about structure, we learned about how to organize structure, and we learned about memorization. Or whatever your central claims were throughout your presentation. And then finally, you should end on what I'm going to call here a closing hook. It's something that they should take away from the presentation. Why they should, at the end of the day, care about what you got up here and told them today. And if you can do this well, they will leave your presentation bringing a lot more out of it than they knew coming into it. And the presentation was out of it there for a second. So now let's go ahead and talk a little bit about organizing your structure. I've told you this general outline of a structure. Well, how do you fill it in? I'm going to teach you something called a bullet point method. And if you've ever outlined anything before, Jacob's really impressed with my technical term over there. If you've ever outlined anything before, it's going to be very similar to what you've done in previous outlines. But I think it's fair to include, just because it really is important when you go into writing a speech to have an idea of what you want to say. So here are some advantages of this bullet point method. First of all, it clearly lays out the logic for you in a way that is very easy to follow. As you're going to see in a second, all of my arguments, all of my claims, all of my evidence, they're going to be on the same page right in front of me. I can reference it easily at any point that I want to see what the strongest pieces of evidence are or the weakest pieces of evidence are without having to dive through hundreds or thousands of words before I write my speech. Second, it's easy to use this sort of an outline to transition to multiple speaking methods. Sure, you can put the bullet points down right in front of you and then speak off those bullet points, but you could also use them to make flashcards that you can use for your presentation. You can also use them to make visual aids for your presentation. You can also use them if you really have to in order to eventually write out a speech if it's required of you to do so. So outlining your speech beforehand allows you to do many different methods of speaking afterwards. And then finally, it's easy to proofread. You can easily look at the logic of your argument or the logic of your presentation and see what questions might people have when looking at this. What questions do I have about what I'm trying to argue? And you can do that by just looking at a few points instead of, again, having to read through hundreds or thousands of words of your speech. So here's the first step in doing this. You remember I told you about a structure for the introduction, the central points, and the conclusion. Well, all you're going to do is you're going to take a Word doc or a piece of paper, and you're simply going to put those bullets in. Not adding anything to them, just having them there so you remember what you need to include in your introduction or in your central points or in your conclusion. So once you've done that, it should take you all of about a minute and a half. What you do is you move on to the second step, which is you can start by filling in the introduction and the conclusion. Now, these are, out of the three sections, the easiest to do. And sometimes I might choose to fill out the introduction first, I might choose to do it a different way, but the way that I find easiest to do is to do the introduction first and the conclusion first, because it reminds you of what your main points are going to be. And also, if you can write a killer introduction, it's going to give you a lot more confidence into writing the central claims of your argument. So how do you fill that in using the bullet point method? Well, it's really easy. All you do is you put in a sub-bullet point underneath the initial bullet point that we just talked about. So underneath my hook, I would describe what I want to lead the presentation off with in one or two sentences. So my completed outline might say, the hook that I did for this speech was that speeches can be intimidating. Here's how you do it well. And I've effectively outlined what I want my hook to be in 2 words. Next, the argument or goal of the speech. Help with structure and memorizing. This is 4 words. Once again, it's just to keep me focused on what I want to prove in my speech. Not supposed to be revolutionary or anything like that. But this is where it's really going to help you out, is when you're filling in your central points. Now, it's really hard when you're trying to give a persuasive speech or an informative speech to keep track of all of the points that you want to bring out through your presentation. So a great way to do that is to outline it using this bullet method. What I'm going to do is I'm going to use an example of something that you might be arguing in here, even some of you. And I'm going to take the claim that the Speaking Fellows are one of the best tutoring resources on campus. Now, I'm sure some of you might dispute that, Jacob, for instance, some of you. So I have to have some claims to back that up. First of all, though, I'm going to write down my central point. which is that the speaking fellows are very effective at teaching. That's going to be one of my very broad points that I'm going to say. But now, I have to back that up with evidence. Jacob might say, well, Garrett, prove that to me. And so here's what I'm going to say, Jacob. My first piece of evidence is that people that come to the speaking fellows walk away very satisfied. And we know this because of student surveys. Student surveys show that 100% of students are satisfied with the speaking fellows. Now don't fact check me on this, I can't imagine it being anything else. But for now, this is what my supporting evidence is going to say. So I've got my first evidence that student surveys are positive. I've got my supporting evidence when I'm asked to prove it, that 100% of students are satisfied based on those surveys. But in addition, I might need something else. I need to have another main claim. And so I'm going to claim that, we are qualified. So we have a sufficient amount of training. We are required to go to a whole semester-long class, and we're required to shadow. And so what I've done here is, when I've outlined this speech, I've shown myself what the logic of my eventual speech is going to be. I've shown myself that my overarching claim for this section is going to be that speaking fellows are very effective at teaching, that my first main piece of evidence is going to be student surveys, my second main evidence is going to be training for speaking fellows, and then I've also put in there ways to prove those main pieces of evidence in case people doubt that reasoning. So then once you've outlined the conclusion, the introduction, and your main points, all you're going to do is put them together on a single document right in front of you. And when you look at all of those points consecutively, you are going to get a wonderful idea of the structure of your presentation, the logic of your argument, and exactly what you're going to want to include when you write or present your speech. Next, you're at the stage where you've written your speech, or you've outlined your speech. Then how do you go about memorizing it? Well, first, I want to preface with a disclaimer. Memorized speeches are great, but depending on the occasion, you might not actually need a memorized speech. It might be helpful for you as a speaker even to have a flashcard, or to have a visual aid with you, or to, in some circumstances, you might be required to write out your speech to give it to someone else. In all of those instances, you do not necessarily need to be memorizing your speeches. However, because I know there are a lot of speakers that do like to memorize their speeches, I wanted to give a few tips. First, there are some prerequisites. Why I told you to outline with the bullet method is because in order to really memorize a speech well, you just have to have a really good understanding of the logic of your speech and the structure of your speech. And to do that, the best way, in my opinion, is to break it into the simplest forms, which is what we did with the bullet point method a second back. So once you know your bullet points and everything like that, next what you have to do is already be convinced you're going to be putting a lot of time into practicing this speech. Because the best way to get really good at something is to be willing to put a lot of time into practicing it. Now that you've convinced yourself of those two things, you're allowed to get started. And so the first tip I've got for you is, one of the things you can do is just use those bullets. So I'm going to use a lot more of this, but a lot of speakers will try to memorize word for word a speech, or they're going to try to do things that make a speech feel very structured, like that. And so one thing you can do is you can just memorize the bullets. An advantage of just memorizing the bullets, knowing the main points, knowing your supporting evidence, is that when you're giving the speech, you're not going to seem structured. You're allowed to go off the cuff. You're allowed to make jokes, you're allowed to make comments, you're allowed to add some personality to your speech. Something that might not necessarily be there if you know every single word. In addition, when you do make a mistake, when you do forget something, when you have a really structured speech and you know all the words, it might mess you up. You might think, shoot, I just said the word and, where am I going with this? I have no idea, and you might freeze up. Whereas if you're using bullets or some other form of speech that is way less prepared, you might be able to recover easily from those mistakes. Because instead of knowing, oh, I had this word, I have to speak the word that was after that in my paper, all you have to do is sort of go for the general idea of what you're going to say. And then as a result, it's also easier to memorize. You have way less words on this piece of paper, the logic's pretty intuitive to you, and then once you've practiced a lot, it's likely that you can go up in front of an audience and give the speech using only the bullets. But of course, that is not the only way you have to memorize speeches. The next tip I would give to you is to memorize by grouping your points. And you might do this, you might not. Some people like to go through and they like to memorize from the beginning to the end in order. And that might not necessarily be the best way for you to memorize their speech. There might be some points that you're very comfortable with. There might be some points that you need more help on. And so as a result, if you group those sections and you memorize by section, then you can focus more on the points that you need to focus on. You can focus less on the points that you're more comfortable with. And in addition, you're sort of drilling into your head the main point that you're really concerned about over and over and over and over again, instead of going back to points that you're comfortable with and drilling those instead. Next is you can go piece by piece still, and you can start by memorizing the big points and then going to the small points. So it's not really effective to memorize your supporting evidence if you don't have any main claims to tie it back to. So what you do is you can start with knowing those main claims. When you look at your outline, or when you look at a written speech, or when you look at your flashcard, are you confident that you know the main claim of exactly what is in this speech? If the answer is yes, well, then you can go ahead and move on to the supporting evidence. If the answer is no, then spend time getting comfortable with what your main point is and drill those main points over and over and over and over again. It goes back to the logic of the speech. When you're comfortable with the logic of the speech, you can fill in the supporting details as you go. So once you're comfortable with those main pieces of evidence, next, one by one, you can add in the supporting evidence. Statistics, research papers, books, things like that, they're hard to memorize word for word or precisely. So adding them on one at a time to your main claims is going to help reinforce the section for you piece by piece instead of just completely overwhelming you. So you're starting just one at a time until you feel comfortable with each section. And then finally, only move on to the next central point or the next part of your speech until you're very comfortable with that part of the speech. Because if you're feeling comfortable with the points that you're struggling with more, it's going to be easier to move on to the points that you're struggling with less. And then finally, I've got miscellaneous tips. So movement is something I find fascinating about public speaking, and it happened when I was in a mock trial round. For that mock trial event, I memorized my speech word for word, and I was going on to my next section, and I was like, I have no idea what is next. I do not know the next word. It started to freeze up, but I did a gesture, and as I did the gesture, the word just came right back to me. It started flowing. And then I started looking into it, and I realized that if you incorporate gestures into your movement, it's really easy to remember what you're going to say because you're always pairing it with your words when you're practicing. So if you forget the word or you forget the gesture, well, chances are you can pair it back to the thing subconsciously in your head, and eventually you can pick right back up. So what I would recommend in a speech, and something that I have started doing after freezing up at that mock trial competition, is in parts of the speech that I'm not as familiar with or that I'm uncomfortable with, or when I transition from one main point to another main point, just so I don't forget what I'm saying, I always like to, in practice, pair it with a gesture. And it's personal preference. You can add a lot of gestures in your speech. You can add a few gestures in your speech. But regardless, when you add gestures in difficult areas and things like that, it will likely help you remember what you were going to say in the event that you sometimes forget. Another tip is to listen to recordings. Now, a lot of people hate listening to themselves in recordings and speeches, and that is understandable. It's not my favorite thing to do either. But what I do notice when I listen to myself in a recording is it's sort of like writing down your notes handwritten. When you write down your notes handwritten, you sort of recognize your handwriting. You can imprint it into your brain more. It makes you understanding your notes feel easier when you're in a class or something like that. Likewise, when you're trying to make a speech, you're going to remember your voice. You're going to remember the things that you did wrong, the things you could have done better, because at the end of the day, you are your biggest critic. And so if you put yourself in the position of an audience member and you listen to yourself, you listen to the structure, you listen to the flow, you listen to your speed, at the end of the day, you're going to find a lot of things that you can improve in your speech that way, and things that can help you with memorizing as well. And then finally, depending on the type of person you are, you might be a visual learner. And I've never actually done this, but I have seen and heard people that explain that as they are speaking, sometimes it helps to have a picture in their mind of what they're going to be talking about next. So, I mean, for this slide, maybe if I didn't have a visual aid and I know that I needed to talk about movement and recording, I could put a mental image in my mind as I'm practicing of just me going about the room with someone recording me or something like that. Just a way for you to, in your head, have a visual outline of the points that you want to get through in your speech in a way that maybe they're telling a story to you. Something that you can remember by simply thinking in your head and looking at a picture. Once again, I haven't ever done this. There's probably a lot of great resources online you can find about how to do it in a way that is effective for you. But for now, I'm just going to include that as a strategy that you can use when memorizing speeches. Now, what have we learned today in the speech? Well, I have to tell you that if I'm going to stick with my own structure. So what we have learned today in the speech is we have learned how to structure a speech as well as how to memorize a speech. And to do that, we looked at 3 points. First, we learned about the general structure of a speech. In addition, we learned about the bullet point method in order to outline the important parts of your speech. And then finally, we learned about how to memorize speeches once you're happy with how they've been written. So, with all of that knowledge in mind, going into the future, we are ready to tackle our public speeches and to give the best presentations of our lives. Thank you all so much for listening to my presentation, and let me know if you have any questions afterwards. You can schedule a speaking fellow session with me and not for Sonali.
We're going to be talking to us about interviews, so a different realm of public speaking, but something that the speaking fellows also help with. And we work in collaboration with the Green Center to offer interview practice. I'll just keep staring at him while he sets up. Does that add pressure?
Charles! It's your boy Charles!
Yeah, he does introduce himself as your boy Charles. That's how I should have introduced you. My bad.
Really? Yeah, I'm pretty sure.
1, 2, 1, 2, mic testing. Hi. Can you all hear me? Okay, so, like said before, it is your boy Charles, he, him pronouns. Today we'll be talking about storytelling and narratives. So I'm not going to be teaching to you like how to write stories, how to be a storyteller. But however, I'm going to be talking about how do you apply storytelling and narratives when you mess up during an interview and you need to get back up. So the disclaimer here is to say, when you've messed up, you've messed up. I'm only teaching damage control, right? So I hope that you actually realize that. I think the first thing to say is that interviews can be nerve-wracking for everyone, including yours truly sometimes. And hence why we have like wonderful resources such as the Green Center, as you can see their logo, or the Speaking Fellows, as you can see their logo, or any other resources online which you can visit. That being said, I think there are mainly like 3 reasons like why people mess up during interviews. And the first one being like nerves, being nervous during a speech. But then also, the other one is like when someone misunderstands the prompt. Suppose the interviewer asks you something and you generally don't understand what they're talking about, and then you start to rambling off and you make a mistake. But then the other one is like when you do understand what they're asking you, but then you didn't think about something hard enough and long enough for you to actually come up with a logical answer, and you say something that is logically like flawed, right? So therefore, what could go wrong in an interview? Like, what are some of the things that you have seen yourself, that I have seen, that actually happen in interviews? I think this is just a list. Of course, it's not all the mistakes that happen, but I think these are the common ones, right? I think the first one are the extremes. These are instances where you over-explain something, when you under-explain something, and you don't find that sweet spot of explanation, right? But then another example of a mistake is when you say contradicting statements between different sections of your interview. And another one is when you sound like too rehearsed, like you're a computer or something, instead of conversational, and you lack that sort of like persona that Garrett was talking about, or when you sound like underprepared for something. Another mistake that usually happens is when you sound inexperienced for the opportunity or for the job that you're applying for, or like when you overstate your weaknesses and don't sound competent enough for the job. So now, before we look at like how to apply storytelling in narratives to pick yourself back up, I think the first thing that we have to do is like look at a more generic example of what storytelling looks like and how you can apply it, right? I think we've all seen some of these images before. Sorry for the graphic content. So what do you see here? And what do all these images have in common? I think something that you ought to understand is like the power of angles, perspective, and narrative. As you can see, the first person, they were not even on a plane. They were using a toilet seat to create that illusion. The kid, he was just messing around. I thought that he was being oppressed. And then the man there, he's just sitting in an awkward position. So the idea is to say, things are not what they seem, and you ought to control the power of shaping what people see and shaping like what they believe to be the truth, which is something that is important. So that being said, if you are genuinely interested in being a storyteller, there is a diagram like about how to do storytelling. For the purposes of this presentation, you can take a screenshot because I won't be going into much depth. I'll be talking about how to apply like good storytelling to actually save yourself when you make a mistake. Okay, so we all have moved from, or we all want to move from a point A to point B. So from point A, someone can see the lion is eating its child, but then however, another perspective is that the lion is just carrying its child. So here we're trying to move from where you've made a mistake and a mess and there's a bad image to a point where you are hired or where you create that happiness, right? So how do you do that? There's a simple process, 3 steps: acceptance, regain control, and leverage. So under acceptance, you have to accept reality, evaluate your position, and assess the damage. So this is where you say it is what it is. So sometimes you make a mistake, accept that you have made a mistake during the interview, evaluate like how deep is this mistake, and then assess like the damage, like what do interviewers think of me. This is something very, very important for the next step. The next step is to regain control. This is the hardest step because you have to point out the mistake, try to normalize it, and then address assumptions. So what does this look like? So there is what we call sunk cost theory. So this is where to say something has already happened, there is nothing you can do to change it. You have already made the mistakes, the interviewers, they already have a view about you, so there is nothing to change it. However, for you to move past that, you have to embrace the awkward. You have to call it out, call out the mistake, and address the assumptions. This is to say, after you leave the interview, the interviewers, they are going to discuss the mistakes that you said. So the best thing is to address it in the interview. Why? Because you have control over that narrative. So if you leave the interview without addressing the mistake, they are still going to talk about the mistake anyways. So the best way is for you to actually own it and take and point it out and say, I know earlier on I said this, or I know I might come off as this, but then try to address this. So when it comes to addressing assumptions, this is where you call them out. Say, I know earlier on I said A and B. I know this is what you might be thinking, and then you move on to the next step. So what is the next step? It's leverage. So the next step is reshaping that the narrative. This is where you take like the bad image and put it into good perspectives, right? And you outline the unique opportunity and you explain the importance of it. So this is where you say, I know I say this is what you might be thinking of me, but this is what I meant about this, and this is why it's important. So I know now I'm talking theoretically, you're wondering, what are you talking about? I think it's time for examples. So what are examples? So suppose okay, before I even go further, another disclaimer is to say, please try to be as honest as possible. So this is not to encourage dishonesty and for people to be lying in interviews, but then for you to actually control the damage that has happened. So suppose you over-explain something, like you're given a question, tell us about yourself, and you spend, say, 6-7 minutes telling them about yourself. How do you get back up? So at some point during the interview, you point it out, you say, I know when you asked me about myself, I spent 7 minutes telling you about myself, or when you asked me about why I love this company, and then I spent like 10 minutes telling you about that. The reason behind is because I'm so passionate about your company, or I'm so passionate about showing like how I fit this role, or I'm so passionate about something. What you have done there, you've addressed what they're going to talk about during like their post-interview, and you are now controlling the narrative. So now when they get to the post-interview, they're saying, that person is very passionate, instead of saying that person isn't concise. However, what happens when you under-explain something? They say, tell us about yourself, and you just say, it's your boy Charles, and you're done. So, the way you do this is to talk about how you were trying to be concise, where you try to cut your words and try to say what is necessary, right? And then you take it a step further by leveraging and say, the unique opportunity about this is that as a company, you need employees that actually get straight to the point, that actually do what is required. So here is to say, instead of them believing that you are not interested or that you are under-explaining stuff, you are showing them that it is important for you to be concise and to be precise. And I think they will be like, this is our guy, right? And then also, what happens when you sound too rehearsed, right? Or like, where, for example, like if I was saying, like what Garrett was saying, like word for word, and I'm not really having that sort of like personality that is important. Talk about how you put so much preparation into it, right? Point it out, say, I know earlier I've been sounding too rehearsed for the interview. However, this goes on to show like how much prep I've put into this, and this goes to show how important I regard this position. Try to convince them, because your life or your future might depend on the opportunity, right? But then, what of instances where you have no experience or when you appear to have no experience? This happened to me like last summer, where I was applying for a position I didn't have any experience for. It was simple. I used that as a strength to say, because I know that I lack experience than Garrett, this is what motivates me to work better than Garrett, right? So I think that worked in my favor, because they're like, this guy has so much motivation, right? And this is what you want them to think about you. You want them to see you as having motivation and as willing to work harder, right? But then also talk about how your lack of experience is exactly the reason why you are not going to be arrogant, but you're going to be willing to learn. So here you're transforming like a bad thing, lack of experience, into actually showing your willingness to learn. I hope like if you try to use this to get into the speaking fellows, and you actually like give you a shot, hopefully you do. But then also, what happens like when you say contradicting statements, right? Suppose earlier on you are saying that, I don't know, like you say something, and then the next part you say another thing. So the way that you can sort of like save yourself is by talking about your ability to adapt to the situation, right? So, and to adapt to like a certain, say, ideas, and like to learn from others. So if they ask you, like, what is your view on society about a certain thing, right? Or like, what's your view about, I don't know, work-life balance? And then along the interview, you realize that like, what you thought was your view is different from what they want. Feel free to be able to change. To say, hey, I know earlier on I said this, but I think like having listened to you speak, I was able to be convinced that you are actually right, or to consider that as a possibility. And then go beyond that to say, as you can see, I'm someone that is willing to adapt in the situation and learn from others. And this is something that is important to this company, right? Like, show that your weakness or like your mess is something that actually shows more of your character, right? How about instances where you over-explain stuff, or where you where you over-explain or you overstate your weaknesses? So this looks like you listing a bunch of weaknesses that you have. Honestly, everyone has a lot of weaknesses, but in most instances, individuals only mention one in an interview, like when they are asked. So when you find yourself having like explained a lot of mistakes, how do you bounce back? So you start by pointing out about how honest and open of a person you are, right? Talk about like how, firstly, you're not the only person that has a lot of these weaknesses, but then you are the only person that is willing to talk about these weaknesses and come out into the open about them. Talk about how you are willing to build that open relationship, one that is filled with honesty and integrity. How about like when you understate your weaknesses, right? Like when they ask you, Charles, what's your weakness? And you say, I'm an overworker, right? Or like, I'm so ambitious, or something like that. So the way you can get back up is try to say, I know earlier on I sounded arrogant, or I sounded as if I didn't have self-awareness, or I didn't know my weaknesses. I think it was just purely motivated by me trying to show that I'm competent for this position. That is why I undersold my weaknesses, right? And then you can use that and say, maybe that is one of my weaknesses, trying to shape what people think of me versus what I'm capable of, and so you can actually use these things to your own advantage. So these are the examples. So during the Q&A, you can ask for other examples. Hopefully I can think of solutions on the spot. But then, so what are the benefits of doing this? So the first benefit is simple. It's damage control. So understand that if you do not do this, the mistake is made and nothing is done to address it. At least if you follow my way, you have some hope of salvation. Sure, maybe it might not work all the time, but then there is at least one instance where it will work. But then also, it displays a fast recovery rate, right? To show that once you fall, you get back up easily. And you can point this out during your interview. You can be look, hey, I fell during the interview. I say something that is contradicting, but then I think I was able to get back up. And this goes on to show how fast I recover. And to say, if you hire me and you give me feedback that contradicts what I already know what I did, then what this means is that I'm able to recover quickly and get back to the task at hand. Trust me, the interviewer is going to shake your hand and say you're hired on the spot. Okay, maybe not like that, but something similar, right? Okay, how about the other aspects? It shows self-awareness and that you're self-critical. So this is to say, it shows that you are always reflecting on your past actions and willing to become better and to be a better person. And I think companies want that, right? People are always looking at how can I become better? How can I improve? But then also, it shows your adaptability, right? Where you are willing to shape yourself and to improve as the situation demands of you. And I think those are strong qualities that you ought to have. So, one of my parting words are simple. Where some see a man with a long beard, some see a chicken eating some food. So the idea here is simple. Nothing is ever as it is. Mistakes and weaknesses are never as they are. You can use storytelling, you can use narratives to actually show that no, this is not a man, this is a chicken. Or to say no, this is not a chicken, no, a man. I don't know what it is, but to build a new sort of perspective. So I would like to give a shout out to all these Western people who are helping with my presentation. Thank you so much.